Hello, my name is Kyle Hirschfeld, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. The museum was started in 1959 by a man named Robert W. Richardson, who desired to maintain and keep a record of Colorado's intense and necessary history with railroads. Indeed, the museum, which was opened in 1959, has been a mainstay in Colorado ever since that opening and continues to be a familial and historical mainstay today. As a rule, generally, railroads proved to be Colorado's lifeblood. Wherever the railroads went, so too did the population go. And wherever the railroads expanded, so too did Colorado's population expand. Thus, the Colorado Railroad Museum, proud of this particular heritage, makes every effort to restore and maintain locomotives of the past so that we in the present might understand the workings of these magnificent machines. One such locomotive which is maintained by the Colorado Railroad Museum is the Galloping Goose, which lies on a track which surrounds the Colorado Railroad Museum, and it rotates around that track about once every 15 minutes, carrying passengers along so that they might see different locomotives of Colorado's past, as well as different buildings and outcroppings that one might have seen 50, 60, 100 years ago. Indeed, some of the rail cars which are maintained, such as the Manitou Springs rail car, they are over 120 years old and were in use well into the 1900s, even after their inception in the 1800s. However, I'd like to take a minute to talk about specifically the Galloping Goose, which was a Great Depression era rail car designed specifically to be cheaper for passengers as well as for the maintenance by railroad companies. The Rio Grande Southern Railroad, upon which the Galloping Goose pictured was in use, called the Galloping Goose cars motors, and this was because they utilized six-cylinder engines instead of the traditional steam-powered or coal-powered engines, making them much cheaper to maintain, much cheaper to produce, and much cheaper to use. And therefore, during the Great Depression, they were much more popular with passengers and with mail carriers, and that's what these cars became. The Galloping Goose, while not very impressive on the outside, was a very magnificent machine for the fact that it provided a very necessary service for those who did not have access to more expensive locomotive types of the past. The Rio Grande Southern Railroad transitioned fully to the usage of the Galloping Goose as passenger and mail cars in the 1930s as prices for steam and coal-powered engines expanded. The museum relied upon volunteer work in order to maintain and upkeep this particular engine. Indeed, it broke down in 1998, and they relied solely upon volunteers in order to reinstitute and revamp the entire engine, which was put back into use in 1998 and was put on tour in 2000 through 2005 around Colorado so that people in Durango, people in the Southwest, the Southeast, could see how these particular rail cars functioned and how well they have held up after nearly 90 years of being out of action. Inside the museum itself lies a treasure trove of historical artifacts and fact sheets informing the visitor of information from the importance of the telegraph in the expansion of railways and the maintenance of railways to the importance of the standard gauge railway and how that came to make the railway system in the United States a mainstay throughout the 1800s and 1900s. Firstly, the telegraph was important because before it was put into widespread use, railway companies relied almost solely upon hand signals. So there would be somebody who would have to go out in front of trains and say, you have to go that way. And obviously, this led to a lot of accidents. It led to a lot of unfortunate results and disasters. So when telegraphs came into being, you were able to telegraph ahead and say, hey, at this time, at 12:05, I need you to reroute the railway so that train B can go to Grand Junction and train A can go up to the South Platte River. Narrow gauge and standard gauge was a big controversy in Colorado, specifically in the late 1800s. And when I say narrow gauge and standard gauge, I'm talking about the width of railways. So narrow gauge was a 3-foot width, whereas standard gauge is a 4-foot, 8 1/4-inch width railway. And the reason that this was such a controversy was that Abraham Lincoln, who had popularized the standard gauge and said this is the standard by which we should all be going along railroads, he did so in order that it would be easier to transport goods, people, troops, etc. throughout the entire nation. However, Colorado and other mountainous regions thought that the standard gauge was a much better option for their particular situations. And this was because the 3 feet of the standard gauge provided for more of a reliable train movement through mountainous terrain, or so they thought. Anyway, it wasn't until the 1870s and 1880s that Colorado and other mountainous areas slowly began to turn to the standard gauge along with the rest of the nation, which in the long run proved to be very beneficial to Colorado and those other states, as it allowed them to trade with counties and states around the nation. The upstairs of the Colorado Railroad Museum is kind of awesome because they have a room in which a video is playing telling you the importance of the expansion of the railroad to Colorado and its population and its economy, as well as the importance of the narrow gauge versus the standard gauge debate. Also in the Colorado Railroad Museum is the Coors Golden Train Car. Now, Coors Brewing Company is, of course, also very important to Colorado's history. Coors Brewing Company expanded in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and eventually became a nationwide phenomenon in the 1970s thanks to Burt Reynolds and his film Smokey and the Bandit. Now, the Coors Golden Train Car, which is maintained by the Colorado Railroad Museum, was actually just a regular railroad car, but they hired Coors employees in the 1970s to come and paint the Coors train car as if it were a car that was in use in the 1920s and 1930s. Also in the upstairs section of this particular museum is a display on the Transcontinental Railroad and the importance of the Transcontinental Railroad to the expansion of Colorado over the course of its inception. It also in the downstairs, which is a very exciting place. In the downstairs area of this particular museum are a whole slew of fantastic displays on railroad tickets, on bandit robberies, on the Ludlow Massacre, on the rights of unions, and on the expansion of the railroads again. And in addition to this are displays created by a woman named Carrie Arnold. who created model trains and very intricate displays that show what people would have looked like in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it's a very detailed, very historically documented model train. It's very exciting. It's very cool to see. Anyway, what this woman, Carrie Arnold, did was she took pictures from Colorado in the late 1800s and early 1900s and used these pictures to recreate the trains. And she also did the same with documents. It was very historically based. And in addition to Carrie Arnold, there is also a display on a man named Ted Rose. Now, Ted Rose is an important figure because in Colorado, what he would do is he would go around to all of these old railroad sites, and he would take pictures of old train cars, and he would paint these train cars in addition. So his particular methods saved and cataloged many of these particular trains for our enjoyment today. As far as the Ludlow Massacre, which I mentioned earlier, is concerned, the Ludlow Massacre was the result of a gigantic, well, I say gigantic in terms of it was a huge coal strike in Colorado. In fact, it was the biggest of its kind up to that time. It led to the United States Army having to come and fight against these coal mining strikers. And it led to the death of 2 women, 11 children. It's called the Ludlow Massacre for a reason, but it basically shut down Colorado Railroad rights for quite a long time. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you ever get the chance to come out to Golden, Colorado, please visit the Colorado Railroad Museum. Thank you.